So today I'm going to be working with that Add-A-Leaf kit you see behind me here, and it's a pretty simple install, but before I do anything suspension related, the first thing you got to do is take some reference measurements to make sure that we're getting what we think we're getting. Before you do anything, especially lifting the vehicle, if you're going to be using a lift, you want to make sure that the front suspension is settled. Visually, this truck is a little bit higher, and you can see that here in the rock rail. The distance from here to the ground appears to be different than the distance from here in the back to the ground. And since that is a frame reference point and a body reference point, that is critical in making the vehicle look like it's level. So it has a little bit of a rearward wake, and that's my fault as I've put a ton more gear in the back. So I'm in full camp mode right now. I've got all of the Roam cases up top, the Overland rough racks, and I've got all my recovery gear as well as my camp gear. The back of the truck is actually full of all my camping utility stuff. So this is an accurate assessment of what exactly my carrying weight would be on the trail. So I'm going to go ahead and take those measurements here and see where my starting point is. Our first measurement in the passenger side rear is going to net us about 40 inches measured through the center line of the wheel to the center bolt of the fender flare. Taking the same on the driver's side, you're going to see 39 7/8. The first step is going to be removing the wheel and tire assembly so we have access space to the spring and the differential. Now, I'm going to be using a lift for this, but if you are using a jack and jack stands, you're going to want to make sure that the jack stands are placed where the rear arm of the lift is. And this is going to be to support the chassis and the weight of the frame just high enough so that we can get the differential into full droop, as we're going to need to, as you can see when I remove the tire here, allow that assembly and the axle to separate so that we can put the Add-A-Leaf in between the factory leaf pack. Next up, we're going to want to position a jack underneath the housing. This is going to be to support the housing weight, not the weight of the vehicle, so we can place it in any number of places as you have space. I'm putting it underneath the rear shock bolt assembly, and that's going to be the first part I take apart. Using a simple wrench on one side and of course a ratchet, or in this case an electric impact, I'm going to remove that shock bolt, and then I'm going to move on to taking off the 4 nuts on the bottom of the U-bolts underneath the spring leaf pack plate. With the plate removed, we can now get the U-bolts off, and that's simply going to be pulling them straight up, making sure we don't get them caught on any of the ABS lines or the brake lines. With the U-bolts removed, we can now get into a position to remove the bolt that passes through the shock. And there's still going to be a little tension here as we do have the weight of the axle, but we're going to want the axle to droop a little lower, just making sure that we don't stretch out any of our lines. This now allows us to take the bump stop off and remove the factory block. Using a set of vice grips, we're going to hold the center pin here, and we're going to relieve the tension of the spring by taking the nut off the top. There isn't a whole lot of tension here, nothing that's unsafe. As you can see, it'll simply allow the leaf pack to separate. Make a note of each of the different layers here. We have the cap at the top and of course the spacers in between that just help the leaves move without making some squeaking sounds. And then we're going to want to lower the rear end as much as we can so that we can wiggle that center bolt out and get the overload spring off. And as you can see, there's 2 pins here, one of which is called the drift pin and the other one of course which is that center bolt. Make a note of the drift pin position as it sits towards the front of the spring. It's not going to be used in the reinstallation as the Add-A-Leaf doesn't have the second hole. It's not a critical part, it just helps the alignment on the stock spring assembly. As I mentioned, we're not going to be using that drift pin, so let's get that center pin out, and we're just going to use the lift block here and a punch and a hammer, and we're going to just lightly tap on that drift pin to knock it out of the spring assembly. Again, it's not critical for what we're going to be using it for, but absolutely necessary to install the Add-A-Leaf. Now we're ready to take a look at the Add-A-Leaf, and you're going to see when we open the packaging here, you're going to find that it has these pads, and these are wear pads that'll go on the leaf spring itself to keep it separated from the rest of them and causing squeaky noises. A quick thing to note of here is that there is a front and back. There's a shorter side, and as you can see, if you flip it around, the bolt hole would not align the spring. So making note of that, we're going to want to make sure that we place the leaf in the proper position, which has the overload spring at the bottom. We want to put our shim pack on top of that, and we want to make sure that we have that short side of the Add-A-Leaf facing the front and the long side facing the rear, and that's going to be installed above the overload and underneath the triple leaf spring pack. Now, using the new supplied center pin bolt, we're going to pass that through where the old center pin bolt is, making sure we're not going through the drift pin hole. And you're going to pass that through the lower overload leaf. There's a shim pack in between, and the only hole in the Add-A-Leaf. Here you're going to watch me kind of struggle a little bit as I get the pin holes lined up through the different layers. I really didn't want to pull the plastic connectors off another time for the ABS and the brake lines on the other side, as I have taken apart the rear end here a couple of times for some of the modifications I've done. There is an easier way if you don't want to struggle through getting each of the layers aligned and having to do it by hand. You can simply disconnect those and drop the axle completely. But if you do take your time, something to note here is that if you do put pressure between these and use the jack to apply pressure to get the pin up, just make sure you don't keep your fingers in between the layers if there's any tension, because as soon as the pin goes through the hole, it might pinch your finger. So here you'll see me use a pry bar and a hammer to just knock that pin into place to make sure my fingers are out of the way. Next, we're going to install that top plate and the shim, and I'm going to use the jack to apply a little pressure as the spring pack is pretty tight. Make note that I still don't have the block in the bottom, so I'm going to be putting a little bit of pressure upward, just enough so that when I compress it, I can get the bolt threads through enough where I'm satisfied I'm not going to damage them. Something to note as well is that we don't have a drift pin, so we're going to make sure that the spring is properly aligned to the Add-A-Leaf. Starting with the rear, take a look at the Add-A-Leaf and that spring pad and make sure it's properly aligned to the rear section. Work your way to the front and you should see everything fall into place. Before we tighten this, we're going to want to drop the axle back down, get our vice grips on that center pin bolt, and tighten the bolt down. Now, we're going to torque this to the specific setting that's required by the Add-A-Leaf, and that is in the instructions. But while we are torquing this down, just make sure that the leaves remain in the right position. Something else to note here, you'll see that the Add-A-Leaf is actually tightly pressed against the upper leaf pack. It's providing preload, which means that bolt that we have is there to allow for that preload to happen, but we're going to need to shorten that so it'll fit underneath that bump stop perch at the top. Here you're just going to need a cut-off wheel of sorts, cut that off, and you can just test fit that bump stop to make sure that it's going to go back together. Here we have an option to restore the stock lift block back into its place to get the maximum advertised lift from the Add-A-Leaf. If you just need a ½ inch or a little bit more, you don't need to put the block in and you're still going to get a little bit more lift than without. Here you're just going to have to manipulate the rear end until you find the pin snaps into place, and you may have to put a little bit more pressure with the jack to get it all to settle in, but that's all it should take and you'll be ready to put the U-bolts back in. When you're hanging the U-bolts, just make sure that you pass through the same area so that you're not pinching that wheel speed sensor or any of the brake lines in the area, and then you'll be able to reinstall that spring leaf plate at the bottom. You're going to see the wear marks where it used to be, and we're going to try to follow that to the best of our ability. When we do install that plate, you're going to want to make sure that the top of the U-bolt doesn't shift and no longer clamp that upper bump stop. Now we can reinstall each of the U-bolt nuts at the bottom. Just make sure you put that washer in first so we can get the proper torque. Install each of the nuts at the bottom, and I'm going to use the electric driver to run the bolts up, but do so evenly. We want to make sure that I'm not applying too much torque now. We're just trying to get everything in the proper position. And as you can see, I'm holding the U-bolts at the top to make sure that the upper bump stop isn't shifting forward or back. And I'm only tightening in a sequence that allows for the same amount of threads to be exposed on each of the bolts. Once I get them to a point where everything is snug, I'm going to go ahead and take the torque wrench and bring them up to the proper recommended torque. Pay attention to your torque pattern as you're going to make sure that each of the pair of nuts on the bottom of the U-bolt are brought up at an equal pace, being that you don't want to tighten one side of the U-bolt and not the other. It's just not going to distribute the load equally across the top of the spring. Next up, I have to align the lower eyelet on the shock to the hole on the axle for the lower shock mount. I'm going to use a punch to get the two aligned, and then I'm going to tap the bolt through. Once the bolt's through, I'm going to reapply the factory nut, use the impact to drive the nut all the way up, and then I'm going to use the torque wrench to apply the proper torque. And there is the final install. You can see the Add-A-Leaf here sits just inside of both of these clamps that hold the top factory leaf pack portion together. Sits in between the factory overload, and you'll see it right here at the bottom. The overall positioning, you just want to make sure your U-bolts are all there, vertical in the same position they used to be. And of course, looking at the nuts and bolts, there's still the appropriate threads coming through. Pretty straightforward, definitely a DIY friendly install. If you don't have a lift, it just takes a couple of jack stands, but it's all the same. Our last step is to get the wheel and tire assembly on the vehicle, and this is sometimes a step I don't show, but it's a pretty important one. Torque values are important for all suspension components, but specifically when we're talking about wheels and tires, it's one of the more critical steps. If you're going to use an impact like you see me use here, that should only be used to run the nut up, and then once the vehicle's settled on the ground, we should be using a torque wrench to get the 140 foot-pounds required for this vehicle. So that's everything installed, and as you can see, we already have a little bit of visual lift. I can see the gap between the tire and the fender well is up. It looks like it's a solid inch, maybe inch and a quarter, maybe even inch and a half, but I'll get those measurements taken as soon as I get it out for a drive. I want to make sure, again, I flex the suspension out, let it find its home, specifically the front. I want to make sure that it settles so that the weight in the back is accurate. But overall, I'm pretty happy with the look, and this just means I'm going to be able to handle all of my camping gear better on the trail, and I'll have a nice level look driving around town. After having driven the truck enough to allow the front suspension to settle and coming back for my post measurement, I'm seeing the rear at 41.5 inches. That's a solid 1.5 inch improvement. And when we look down at the rock rail and the frame area, I'm seeing 19.25, and that's a 1 3/8 improvement from where we started before. This means that the Add-A-Leaf worked as advertised. It's going to give me about 750 pounds of capacity. That's about what I've got in the back of the truck with all my camp gear, which means now I have a properly leveled vehicle with a little bit of a forward rake in it, but I'm happy with the looks, and probably more importantly, I'm eager to get this out on the trail to see how well it complements all the other suspension mods I've made on the vehicle.